Gate, a suffix used to describe hardware or software defects that cause widespread issues. And when it comes to iPhones, there's been quite a few over the years. Some of these issues were just minor annoyances, but some were so bad that Apple had to publicly respond, sometimes even offering free fixes. So today we're going to be going over some of the biggest iPhone gates to ever happen, the ones that were so bad that they forced Apple to respond whether they wanted to or not. And just to clarify, I'm only going to be focusing on major, well-known iPhone issues, so I won't be talking about every small bug or rare hardware defect. But if I miss any big ones, let me know in the comments. So let's start with the one that kicked off the entire gate trend, Antennagate. The iPhone 4 was easily the biggest upgrade to the iPhone since the original one. It had a completely new design, the first ever Retina display, and a premium glass and metal design that made the previous models look outdated. At the time, this iPhone was getting a ton of attention, and for good reason. It looked futuristic compared to anything else on the market. But there was just one problem. Apple had redesigned the iPhone's antennas to be built into the frame of the phone itself. In theory, this was supposed to improve reception, but in reality, holding the phone a certain way could cause your signal to completely drop. And we're not talking about a rare issue here. This happened to a lot of people. The problem got so bad that it became the first major iPhone gate, and it was quickly dubbed Antennagate. Apple's response? At first they tried to downplay the issue, famously telling people that they were just holding their phone the wrong way, but after enough backlash, Apple had to do something. And their solution was to give out free bumper cases. To be fair, the cases actually did fix the issue by preventing direct contact with the antenna, but the fact that Apple had to do this in the first place wasn't a great look. And this clearly wouldn't be the last time that the iPhone had a hardware problem that made headlines. So with that, let's move on to the iPhone 5 and its own unique issue, Scuffgate. The iPhone 5 may have fixed Antennagate, but that didn't mean it was immune to problems. This time, instead of signal issues, the problem was all about durability. Apple decided to ditch the glass back from the iPhone 4 and 4S in favor for an all-aluminum body. This made the phone thinner, lighter, and stronger in some ways, but there was one major downside: scratches. And I'm not talking about normal wear and tear. People were getting noticeable scuffs and chips straight out of the box. The issue was even worse on the black iPhone 5. The anodized aluminum finish made even the smallest scratches stick out like a sore thumb. Some people even reported paint chipping off, revealing the silver aluminum underneath. So what did Apple do? Well, nothing really. They didn't offer a fix like they did with Antennagate. Instead, they just brushed it off, saying that the scratches were just a normal part of using an aluminum phone. Sure, they weren't wrong, most metal phones will eventually scratch, but the fact that some iPhones were already scuffed right out of the box made this feel less like normal wear and more like a design flaw. Luckily, the next iPhone didn't have the same issue, but it did have a much bigger problem, one that became the most infamous iPhone controversy of all time: Bendgate. The iPhone 6 series was a huge deal. It had a brand new design, way bigger screens, and was Apple's thinnest iPhones ever. And while the thinner design made it look sleek, it also made the phone way less durable. It didn't take long for people to start noticing something weird. Some iPhone 6 Plus models were bending from normal use just from being in people's pockets. And once the internet got a hold of this, it blew up. People started intentionally testing how easy it was to bend their iPhones, and the results were not great. The iPhone 6 Plus was so weak that even the slightest pressure could warp the frame. At first, Apple downplayed the issue, saying that only a few customers were affected. But internal documents leaked later on, showing that Apple knew that the iPhone 6 was way more likely to bend than previous models. So what was Apple's solution? Well, they didn't do much for iPhone 6 Plus owners, but they did make a big change with the iPhone 7 Plus. The next generation had a more reinforced frame, making it almost impossible to bend. So even though Apple never admitted fault, it was pretty clear that they knew Bendgate was a real problem. But this next controversy, Apple couldn't just ignore it. So let's talk about Batterygate. This one's a little different from the other gates we've talked about so far. While most iPhone gates happened right at launch, this one didn't become a controversy until years later. And when people found out, they were not happy. So here's what happened. Over time, older iPhones started feeling way slower than they used to. At first, people just assumed it was paranoia, but in 2017, some independent testing confirmed that Apple was actually throttling performance on older iPhones. And once this info went public, everyone lost it. People were furious, and honestly, it was easy to see why. Apple never told anyone they were doing this. Apple's explanation: they claimed that they were slowing down phones on purpose to prevent unexpected shutdowns due to aging batteries, and technically this did make sense. Older batteries don't hold as much charge, and throttling performance helped them last longer. But here's the problem. Apple just didn't tell anyone. If they'd been transparent from the start, this probably wouldn't have been as big of a deal. But instead, they got hit by multiple lawsuits and had to offer cheap battery replacements for affected iPhones. Normally, replacing an iPhone battery costs $79, but with Batterygate, Apple dropped it to $29 for a limited time. And to make things even more awkward, Apple later added a setting in iOS that let users turn on the throttling if they wanted to. So yeah, they could have definitely handled this better. But while Batterygate affected performance, the next issue was a straight up hardware defect, one that came with Apple's first OLED iPhone. So let's talk about the green line of death. The iPhone X was easily one of the biggest upgrades to the iPhone ever since the iPhone 4. It introduced Face ID, an edge-to-edge OLED screen, and completely ditched the home button. It was a huge deal, but with such a big redesign, there was also a big risk for issues. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. Some iPhone X models started developing a random, bright green line running vertically down the display. Once it showed up, there was no way to get rid of it. The line didn't go away with the restart, and it wasn't caused by software, it was a hardware defect with the new OLED panels Apple was using. Some people speculated it had to do with voltage issues with the display's wiring, but Apple never officially explained why it happened. Luckily, Apple did the right thing here, and replaced affected units for free under warranty. So if your iPhone X had this issue, you could just walk into an Apple store and get a new one. But what's interesting is that unlike other iPhone issues, this one never got the gate label. Instead, people just called it the green line of death. And honestly, the name kinda fit. But even if this wasn't ever officially labeled as a gate, it was definitely widespread enough to be on this list. Now, while this was a hardware problem, the next controversy was purely software based. Beautygate. The iPhone XS was one of Apple's more incremental updates. It kept the same design as the iPhone X with some camera and performance improvements. Nothing too crazy. But one of those camera improvements ended up being a little too aggressive, and it didn't take long for people to notice. As soon as people started taking selfies with the iPhone XS, something felt off. Skin looked way too smooth, almost like there was a built-in beauty filter. The texture on people's faces looked airbrushed, and details were getting completely lost. At first, some people thought Apple had secretly added a beauty mode like the ones found on Android phones, but it turns out that this was actually due to smart HDR overprocessing skin tones. The iPhone XS was automatically reducing noise in photos, which ended up softening people's faces more than it should have. And the weirdest part? There was no way to turn this off. If you took a selfie with the XS, it just looked like that. And considering Apple usually markets their cameras as being the most natural and realistic, this wasn't a great look for them. Thankfully, this was probably one of the easiest iPhone gates to fix. Since it was a software issue, Apple was able to easily patch it with an iOS update by tweaking the way Smart HDR handles faces. So compared to something like Bendgate or Batterygate, this was a pretty minor controversy. But what's interesting is that most of these iPhone gates happened years ago. In recent years, we haven't really seen any hardware or software issues that blow up into a full-blown controversy. And there's a pretty simple reason for that. For one, iPhone upgrades have become way more incremental. Apple isn't making huge design changes every year like they used to. Instead of completely overhauling the iPhone's body or adding a brand new hardware feature, they're refining what's already there. And when you're making smaller changes, there's less that can go wrong. Another reason is that Apple has learned from their past mistakes. Apple knows that they can't afford another major controversy, so they've gotten better at catching these issues before they launch. But that's not to say that iPhones don't have problems anymore. There's still a ton of bugs and performance issues, and some minor defects here and there. But compared to the early days, it's been pretty smooth sailing. But for now, that's pretty much the history of major iPhone gates. But make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments if you think there's another infamous iPhone issue that should have made the list.